Hello everyone, and welcome to my channel. This channel is for educational purposes, and we try to hone you in to some great out there theories that you probably have never heard of before, earth-shattering discoveries, grand unified theories, but you probably haven't heard of them, but if you did, they'd make a big impact on your life. And this is our 184th Bible Decode. We're looking at the New Testament again, and we are going over the Roman origins hypothesis to the New Testament, which has been articulated by many historians over the last, especially the last 25 years, but going back all the way to Bruno Bauer's work in the late 1870s. And the basic idea is that the New Testament was written by the Romans, not by the illiterate apostles who spoke Aramaic in Judea, but by the Roman Caesars, who were literate in both Latin and Greek. And the New Testament was written in Greek. The Romans in question were the Caesars, the Roman Caesars, the rulers, the kings of the Roman Empire, and in particular the Caesars from the Flavian dynasty. That is Emperor Vespasian and his two sons, Emperors Titus and Domitian, that were in charge of the Roman Empire from 69 until 96 AD. And Vespasian and Titus had both just come off a war. They were military generals before being named emperor, and this war was against the Jews, called the War of the Jews, from 66 to 73 AD. They were both wounded in the war, and they were both very sick of dealing with the Jews, because the Jews were the essence of a high maintenance colony for them. The Jews had their monotheistic God that saw them as the chosen people, leading to separatism and xenophobia. Their God also was quite insecure. He was zealous and jealous, and he also had obsessive compulsive disorder, leading to a panoply of rituals that had to be performed by the Jews, strictures against arbitrary things like graven images and circumcision, Passover animal sacrifice rituals. The god was also strongly addicted to smoking animal fat, and so he had them doing all kinds of animal sacrifices. And God was also quite indecisive and arbitrary and capricious, and definitely not omnipotent, because he needed to rest every 7 days. And so he forced them to to observe the Sabbath every Saturday, where they did nothing, and they were allowed to do nothing except for worship him. So these things all led to the Romans just being clashing with the Jews over these matters. At one point, Emperor Caligula attempted to put a statue of Caesar in the Roman temple, or in the Jewish temple, and that led to a literal war in the late 30s AD. the Jews were willing to die to maintain their rituals and, their Sabbath and, their sacrifices. And the the Romans were happy to kill them, but it took a lot of resources for them to do so. They had dozens or even hundreds of other nations under their umbrella, and they couldn't just put all their attention on the Jews. And I think that was a lot of the thinking of Vespasian and Titus when Vespasian became emperor in 69 AD, leaving his son Titus in charge of the military for the last 3 years of that war. And then Titus eventually utterly destroyed Jerusalem in 70 AD, and eventually Masada in 73 or maybe even 74 AD to kind of put an end to the war. That ended, according to the history that they wrote about the event, culminated in a mass suicide of Jews who were willing to kill themselves before surrendering to the Romans. That was kind of what the Jews were waiting for. They were waiting for a Messiah. And the Messiah that they were waiting for was a military general who would, rise them up together to kick out the Romans. And 3 self-proclaimed Jewish messiahs all kind of got together in 66 AD and literally did kick out the Roman puppet kings called the Herods, Herod Agrippa, and made him flee back to Rome, which caused Emperor Nero, possibly on a tip from a guy named Saulus, who may have been Paul, to Nero, who then sent in General Vespasian to put down the revolt. So, part of the thinking there for, in a later period, 5 years later, or after the war was over, for Vespasian and Titus was, let's figure out some way to mellow out these Jews. Get them to soften up their militancy and, to be more obeisant to the Romans. And so they wrote a story of a Jewish Messiah who was a Prince of Peace and who believed in rendering unto Caesar what is Caesar's, walking an extra mile with Roman soldiers' pack, turning the other cheek to oppression, believing that the Roman centurion, slave-owning soldier had the greatest faith in all of Israel, and exhorting his God to forgive the Romans when absolutely never, ever saying the same thing about the Jews. And also going outside the Jewish temple and overturning the tables of the Jewish money changers who were trying to provide kosher money so that the Jews could buy small animals to bring inside the temple for the ritual, and excoriating the Jews who were out there selling those small animals for the rituals. So this Jesus character in the Gospels is completely deferential to Rome, at the same time as taking direct aim at the Jewish rituals that the Romans hated so much. In fact, James Valiant and I think its name is C.W. Fahey, talk about this in their book Creating Christianity, that the Gospels could not be more favorable to the Romans if you designed them to be that way. they favor the Romans at every single point. So that is part of the Roman origins hypothesis, but it goes a million miles beyond that because you can also, so that's the motive. You got the circumstantial evidence, so you got the MO. The Romans had created a number of other religions in the first century. Titus created two in his life. Vespasian created at least one other religion created for psychological operation purposes in order to, persuade somebody to do something or to convince, to, a psychological operation, psychological warfare. The Romans were masters of it. And the Romans also had a monopoly on censorship. They had a monopoly on publishing. They had a monopoly on distribution. They were the only people who could have even done it. But instead, we decided that it's a bunch of illiterate Judeans writing in Greek, even though they didn't even write in their own language, which was Aramaic. And but the evidence goes way beyond that, because at the same time that the Romans wrote the New Testament, they also wrote a book, 7 volumes, a history of the war between the Jews and the Romans, called War of the Jews, or Jewish War. They wrote this book under the name of Josephus. Don't know whether Josephus really existed. Most people think he did. But whoever Josephus was, whether it was a team of people, a single person, a family of people, the emperors themselves, or whoever, or Josephus, whoever that entity was, also wrote the New Testament, because the amount of parallels between the two are way beyond, statistical possibility to be random. They were clearly intentional and intended to communicate a message, a code, or many separate codes. So one of the vehicles that they use to convey some of these parallels is the 3-year ministry of Jesus in Judea in the New Testament, in the Gospels, and the 3-year military campaign of Titus in Judea. Every place that Titus goes in his military campaign, Jesus also goes. And they go there in the same order. And they encounter parallel events at each location that are set off by 40 years exactly. And it's not just a couple of events. It's over 40 separate events, as recounted by the book of Luke and the book of the War of the Jews. I should have mentioned this earlier, but we know whoever Josephus was, according to his autobiography, he was living at Caesar's palace in a townhouse. His name was Flavius Josephus, as he was a adopted member of the family of the dynasty of the Flavians. And he was roundly endorsed by Titus. So whoever Josephus was, he was emanating from Rome. So by that logic, the New Testament also emanated from Rome. A lot of the prophecies that were given by Jesus in the New Testament, or really all of them, are fulfilled in the pages of War of the Jews. In particular, the prophecy that foresees the second coming of Jesus, which is the destruction of the temple of Jerusalem, which was fulfilled by Titus. Titus was the second coming of Jesus. And that's exactly what the Romans intended. They intended to graft themselves onto the Jewish tradition. The Jewish tradition was often talked about like a plant, a root, the root and branch, or kind of like a family tree, because a lot of it was based on who begat whom. And Titus and Vespasian, but particularly Titus, grafted himself onto the culminating point of the Jewish tradition, the second coming of Jesus. And in the War of the Jews, that language is used over and over again, pruning and grafting, and even they have one character there whose name was Pedanius. Pedanius was is really like the father of homeopathy, and he was a leading botanist, and he was along for the ride with Titus and his entourage at this siege of Jerusalem. So that symbolism goes in there throughout. That was really the intention of the Jews. Another intention was really just to humiliate and excoriate and ridicule the Jews, not only for being who they were, but also for believing the Gospels, whoever believed it. I think another motive for Titus was to convince the Jews to worship him. He could, no matter what happened, he could not get the Jews to worship him or even to bow down to him, because they would rather be killed than to do so. And so Titus had this mission to trick the Jews into worshiping him, or at least bowing down to him. Now, that sequence of Titus and Jesus's residencies in Judea being mirrors of each other was first discovered by Joseph Atwill in his book Caesar's Messiah, or at least the entire strain was noticed by Atwill. Another author, Michael Menescotts, came along just last year and went further into the book of Luke in his book Christianity's Origins as a Flavian Secrecy Cult, and found over 250 parallels between the book of Luke and the War of the Jews. 250 in the book of Luke. There's only 1,151 verses in the book of Luke. That's one every 4.6 verses, meaning that the book of Luke is saturated with parallels from Josephus. And not only that, and some of the parallels will floor you. Not all 250, but at least like 10 to 20, 25 of the parallels are really, really, really strong. Like that, you'll be shocked at how well hidden, how detailed, how carefully crafted these parallels are. Some of them are just offhand and could be easily coincidental, but just the sheer number of them mitigates, against that. Maybe a few of them are coincidental, but not all 250, and certainly not the strong ones. The strong ones are enough to stand up by themselves. And not only that, but Menescotts actually grafts the parallels on a chart, putting the book of Luke on the vertical axis and War of the Jews on the horizontal axis. He finds that when he plots all 250 plus points, he forms 5 near perfect letters in Latin, the language of the Roman government. Most of the Roman citizens spoke Greek. The Roman government was done in Latin, and they all spoke Greek too. APTVS. The T and the V and maybe the S would be Titus Vespasian. Not sure about the other 2 letters or 3 letters, but the main point is that the Romans literally signed their name to the book of Luke just in order to mock whoever believes in it more. These people were very mean-spirited, and you can see the hate, just seeping out of some of the parallels once you figure out the code. Now, what we're looking at today, we first looked at the work of this Christian apologist, Lee Strobel, his case for Christ, and showed that that his case for Christ makes an even better case for Caesar. Now we're looking at a work from David Fitzgerald called Nailed, and he's like really an atheist. And so his book is like, 10 myths that Christians want you to believe in order for you to believe in Christianity or something like that. And it suffers as well from not understanding the Roman origins hypothesis. And we are, I think, on one of the first couple of myths here. But he's talking about a lot of the ancient writers, the very few ancient writers who ever even mentioned Christ or Christianity, usually just in offhanded manners, but he doesn't mention the fact that they're all part of the Roman government. And so, of course, they mention Jesus, because that's what they were trying to propagate. They were trying to historicize Jesus. So they wouldn't focus on Jesus, but they would mention him. And he's talking about Jewish historian Justus of Tiberias, from Jesus' hometown, and died in 101 AD, was personal secretary to King Herod Agrippa II, who allegedly met Apostle Paul. So Agrippa II is the one that fled Rome when the 3 Jewish zealots rose up and kicked him out in 66 AD. And even wrote a history of the kingdom of Judah covering the entire time when Jesus lived. But he does not mention Jesus. Now, this is a Jewish historian. Also, Nicholas of Damascus, late 1st century BC, early 1st century AD, was, among other things, tutor of Cleopatra and Mark Antony, and personal friend, advisor, and court historian to King Herod the Great. He would have been an eyewitness when the wise men came to Herod's court and so badly troubled the king that he decided to kill all the young boys in the town or whatever. And he doesn't mention it either. The Magi deceived him. He went into a rage and dispatched his soldiers to kill all infant boys in Bethlehem and all its districts. That's Mark 2:16. He was certainly interested. This guy Nicholas of Damascus, he was interested in fringe religions and not afraid to talk about them. He wrote a great deal on other Jewish sects of the time. I don't really know about that. I think very little of, if any, of Nicholas of Damascus' work survive the test of time. I mean, in terms of archaeology, we don't have any copies of his work. I think the only thing that we have is like other people who commented on his work. Anyway, also Philo of Alexandria, who was a Jew, was in just the right time and place to be a brilliant historical witness to Jesus. But again, not a word. Now, some people who propagate the Roman origins hypothesis believe that Philo was actually this guy Arius Piso, I'm not sure, who is maybe the A and the P of the AAPTVS. He might have been the main author of the New Testament. He wrote under a ton of other alias names, and some of the more conspiratorial part of the Roman origins hypothesis believe that he wrote as Philo as well. He's talking about Aelius Aristides, not to be confused with the Christian apologist Aristides, but he was a famous Greek and Marcus Cornelius Fronto, Discourse Against the Christians. But we're already talking about 100 years after the so-called death of Jesus by now. So nobody other than Roman royalty had said a single word about Jesus and his exploits in the 100 years after he died. The only people were Josephus, Suetonius, Tacitus, Pliny the Younger, and Trajan, all of whom were either Roman emperors or very close to Roman emperors. Maximus of Tyre, we're talking about 2nd century now. He refers to a book called Frank Zindler's the Jesus the Jews Never Knew. I think he's a big atheist. Now, me personally, I have an even bigger problem with atheism than I have with Christianity. I talk about for the Reciprocal Church that we are trying to be a parachute for anybody who's following any of the 5 Western religions, major Western religions, that are all about to crash and burn under the weight of no evidence. And out of those 5 religions, probably Christianity is probably my favorite of the 5, because at least it's a limited hangout. The Romans had to put some good stuff in there, some quality, stuff that you can, that you can hang your hat on, that you can really believe in, that's even somewhat beautiful, into their text, because it was a limited hangout. You have to put some stuff in there that's good. Not to mention the fact that the Romans wanted the Jews to be good citizens. They wanted them to be honest, hardworking, law-abiding, and so that reflects on Christians today. Now, the other religions, Judaism, Islam, Satanism, and atheism or scientism, suffer from different reasons. Actually, the Satanism is the same reason, because the Satanism comes right out of the New Testament as well. The Satan is scarcely mentioned in the Old Testament, and when it is, it's referring to a adversary or an obstacle, referring to a human being, not some kind of supernatural monster. That really is hardly even in the. It's not in the New Testament that much either. Most of it is coming from Hollywood, by way of Dante and Milton. Okay, now we get to Constantine, the first Christian emperor who wasn't really a Christian. Oh, he says he never stopped being a pagan emperor as well. He was into the sun worship, and really the Jesus story, when decoded mythologically or astrologically, is also a paean to sun worship. The 12 disciples are the 12 houses of the sun, or the 12, the 12 zodiac names or whatever. It's all about the Jesus follows the various disciples around the zodiac. And, Jesus is born at the winter solstice. There's 3 days where the sun is at its lowest point, and then Jesus develops and flowers as we go into the spring and summer, so on and so forth. Now we're getting back to talking about Josephus. Now Josephus is extolled by Christians a lot throughout, hated by Jews in general because he was a traitor to the Jews. He was supposed to have been a Jew and one of the military commanders for the Jews, but he surrendered to Vespasian, and in doing so, he recognized that God now favors the Romans and not the Jews, and then so he defected to the Jews. So he's a traitor to the... And then he did a lot of action that caused great harm to the Jews. This is according to his autobiography, if you even believe that he even existed. But so he wrote this War of the Jews in the 70s AD. But he lived at Rome the rest of his life, more or less, and he wrote the Testimonium Flavianum, which is just one paragraph within his 20-volume work called Antiquities of the Jews, where he basically paraphrases the entire Old Testament and then brings it all the way up until the 1st century. And he writes a whole paragraph about Jesus, which many scholars actually believe that it was inserted centuries later by probably Eusebius in the early 4th century. He was like a running mate of Constantine's. Like, he was Constantine's, henchman, more priest henchman. And